Good day. There is still a dearth of news about what is going on the Ukrainian battlefields, except that Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government, has come and said that there's been significant progress made by Russian forces in Marinka, that the Russians are continuing to make headway in Bakhmut, and that they're also making progress in a place called Gorlovka, near Gorlovka, which is also another town in the Donetsk area. Another one of our regular commentators, if I can put it like this, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko of the Lugansk militia, has also said that Ukrainian troops in the Krasny Liman area, as he puts it, the Liman area, in other words, in northern Donbass, in northern Donetsk region, are now very short of ammunition. I'm going to return to the topic of ammunition shortly. Alongside all of these reports from Russian sources, which, as I say, don't tell us a huge amount, there was a very interesting report in The Guardian which admitted that Russian electronic warfare is now becoming increasingly effective in preventing Ukraine's effective use of its drones. And there's some suggestions that Ukrainian use of drones will become much more difficult within the next few weeks or months. One Ukrainian soldier put it up to 4 months, but that might be an optimistic estimate based on some of the other things that were said in the article. Meanwhile, we've been getting more and more information about the Russian Air Force being much more active on the battlefronts. There was reports of more Russian airstrikes in the north, around the Zarublets River. I'm not quite sure where that is, but apparently it's somewhere on the front lines, and I get the sense that this is somewhere in on the northern areas of the battlefronts. There's also been more Russian airstrikes apparently in the Avdiivka area, and also, and importantly, in the area of Orekhov, which is this town in Zaporozhye region, which the Russians approached in January, and which appears to be the main base area for the Ukrainian offensive when it's about to happen. And in fact, it's increasingly clear to me that the main balance of Russian air activity has now shifted from, or is gradually shifting from missile strikes, though it's important to say that these do still take place, but from missile strikes to bomb attacks with precision-guided bombs. Russia's been using its 500-kilo precision-guided bombs in Ukraine for some time. They were the bombs that were increasingly used in the Avdiivka area, for example, leading to the major Russian advances there. But Russian precision-guided bombs of 1,500 kilos are also being used increasingly in the battlefields. Now, when I say this, I would say that this is not yet remotely an air campaign on the scale of what the United States would launch, say, against Iraq back in 1991 and in 2003. We're not looking at air campaigns on that kind of scale. I doubt that the Russian Air Force has the air assets, sufficient air assets, to conduct an aerial campaign on that scale. Its missile campaign, by the way, has been on a much bigger scale than anything that the United States has ever undertaken. But its air campaign has clearly been smaller. That's partly because some Ukrainian air defense systems still undoubtedly survive. The Ukrainian air defense system still exists. It's not been completely extinguished. So the Russians have to be careful They can't send fleets of aircraft and fleets of bombers operating over Ukrainian battlefronts and Ukrainian cities and over logistic centers, as if there was no Ukrainian air defenses to speak of. I think it's also a function of the fact that Russia anyway has a much smaller air force than the United States does. It's a powerful air force by the standards of any country other than the United States, but it is significantly smaller, very much smaller than the air force of the United States. So I don't think that Russia actually has the capability to conduct an air campaign of the kind that the United States regularly does in the various wars that the United States fights. But maybe the Russians calculate that they don't need to. And I would point out that given that precision-guided aerial bombs don't use rocket or jet engines, apparently after they're launched, for most of the distance that they travel, they operate in a kind of automated mode, so they don't actually they're effectively jam-proof as well. They're much more simple pieces of equipment than cruise missiles are, by way of illustration. That means that using them must be an awful lot cheaper than using cruise missiles and long-range missiles like the Russians have been doing. So from a Russian point of view, it makes complete sense now that they can operate their aircraft increasingly over Ukraine, that they should be using more bombs and in more quantities and doing probably more damage with these bombs than some of these cruise missile strikes can. Certainly no Russian cruise missile carries the amount of explosive in its warhead that a 1,500 kilo bomb kilo bomb can do. And I think if we're talking about attacks on bridges, that basically it makes more sense, in fact, to use these bombs than it does to use these missiles, as I've speculated about in the past. Now, before I leave this particular topic, I would say that it's been interesting to see that the Russian Air Force has been using bombs increasingly against bridges. And given that the Russian Air Force doesn't have a huge amount of experience in using precision-guided aerial bombs, certainly not the sort of experience that the US Air Force does, I suspect that some of what is going on is basically the Russians familiarizing themselves with the techniques, learning how to use bombs and how to use them most effectively. So they're launching bomb attacks on relatively small bridges for the moment, using, so far as I can see, only 500 kilo bombs at the moment. And of course, as they gain proficiency and understanding, perhaps they will start to deploy the bigger bombs, the 1,500 kilo bombs against bridges, the bigger bridges, maybe even the Dnieper bridges later in the war. And can I say that I suspect that even a single 1,500 kilo bomb would probably not be enough to destroy one of these massive bridges that the Soviet Union built across the Dnieper, but perhaps 3 or 4 bombs could, and it would certainly be cheaper to launch or to drop 3 or 4 precision-guided bombs against a bridge than to launch a couple of hypersonic missiles against a bridge, which is what I was speculating that which is what I was speculating that the Russians might do in earlier programs. So it seems to me that the Russians are rehearsing, they're preparing, they're gaining ground in these crucial battlefronts, they're continuing to make progress. Incidentally, there have been a number of reports that the Ukrainians were able to prevent the Russians closing their pincers around Bakhmut. And I think this is true. I mean, the Ukrainians deployed large numbers of troops to the Bakhmut battlefronts. They held on grimly in places like Ivanivska and Khromovo. The Russians have never, so far as I know, fully occupied areas of these roads, not until this point. And there have been some reports in the Western media that have counted this as a success. I don't think this is correct at all. I think that, on the contrary, Ukraine deploying forces, some of the forces that were apparently earmarked for the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, to hold places, little places like Khromovo and Ivanivska against the Russians, exposing those troops, those Ukrainian troops, to constant shelling, leading them to suffer heavy casualties, and to continue to try and use these roads to send in supplies into Bakhmut at night. I've discussed in previous programs the harrowing pictures I've been seeing of the devastation that this is causing to Ukraine, that we see the roads now littered with burnt out Ukrainian vehicles. And as I said, I suspect lots of men have been dying trying to use these roads and the fields and the country lanes. Well, all of this, it seems to me, is completely misconceived. And I think it's what the Russians want to see happen. After all, it was General Surovikin who, way back in October, I think it was, gave an interview saying that his aim was to grind the Ukrainians down. And Prigozhin has confirmed that General Surovikin played a key role in planning the Battle of Bakhmut back in the summer, and that this was his plan to use Bakhmut to some extent as this meat grinder, horrible expression, but an accurate one, I suppose, in some ways, to grind down the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. And we can see that Ukraine, by trying to hold on to this small place, is playing straight into Surovikin's plan. They are committing some of their best trained troops, some of their best equipment, to trying to retain control of this small place. A strategically important place, admittedly, but they're committed to doing it. And the result is that more and more of their forces are being ground down there and are not going to be able to participate in this counteroffensive in Zaporozhye. And this is what I'm now going to come to, because we've now had a whole series of leaks to the Washington Post, to the New York Times, which make it absolutely clear that there are now growing doubts, or have been growing doubts all along, in the United States about the merits of this counteroffensive. We're told that Ukraine is only likely to make small, modest, incremental gains. It's unlikely to be able to sever the land bridge to Crimea. I'm not sure why people assume that it would be a decisive win if it cut it, but anyway, I guess it pass on. The United States expects that it's not going to be able to make more than modest gains, this offensive. It appears to accept that Ukraine is going to suffer extremely heavy losses carrying out this offensive. On that topic, by the way, I read a report earlier today that Ukraine is going to try to compensate for its lack of artillery, its lack of shells by deploying more infantry. In other words, it's going to send infantry to attack Russian positions without artillery support, and is hoping that throwing waves of, well, I don't want to say waves, but anyway, throwing large numbers of presumably lightly equipped infantry without artillery support against Russian fortifications is somehow going to help Ukraine achieve a breakthrough. It might do in a few places, but Russian defenses in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, in Donbass are now layered. We've been told that there are, Jan Gagin, I think it was, who said that the Russians now have up to 4 layers of defenses. These are very heavily fortified defenses. One can see why the Pentagon now accepts, or at least some people in the Pentagon now acknowledge, that gains are going to be modest. And frankly, sending infantry against heavily fortified positions defended by artillery and drones, and with a defender having overwhelming superiority in the air, and now being able to launch heavy precision guided bombs. Well, to my mind, this sounds absolutely terrible. It looks like the casualties Ukraine is going to suffer over the next few weeks, once the offensive gets going, is going to be horrendous. And we're getting all this information, interestingly enough, from this big document dump. And I think it is now universally acknowledged that people like Larry Johnson are absolutely right. As I said, I consider Larry Johnson's views about the authenticity of these documents to be authoritative, that these documents that have been produced since January are genuine, they are real, they are indeed classified internal US documents, apparently intended primarily for General Milley and for the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're giving us a picture, a very bleak picture, of the situation for Ukraine on the eve of this offensive. And by the way, these documents also make it very clear that if the defensive fails, or if it fails to achieve a breakthrough, then there is no possibility of Ukraine being re-equipped again to the level that it was last summer, or again this winter, in preparation, in anticipation of those offensives that took place in the autumn, and of this offensive which is coming this spring or summer. So that brings me back to the fundamental question. First of all, a few fundamental questions. If so, if these documents are genuine, who leaked them? I have no doubt that they were leaked now by people within the Pentagon. In fact, I'm going to make a guess. I think this was a carefully planned, authorized leak, authorized by somebody very important with access to this kind of information, and probably widely discussed. I have spoken previously about the fact that there's clearly been an argument going on at the highest levels of the US government. We got the first indications of this with the publication of that Rand Corporation study some weeks ago, which said that the United States could not afford a prolonged war in Ukraine. A prolonged war in Ukraine was contrary to US interests. And there were other studies from all sorts of places. There's a study from the CSIS about, in fact, there's been more than one study about US ammunition and weapon system shortages, that this war is intensifying. I've also received, there's also been lots of reports about the fact that the Europeans are no longer able to sustain support for Ukraine at the necessary levels. It seems that the plan to supply Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells from the European Union has now collapsed. It's not going to happen. It seems also that the plan to supply Ukraine with large numbers of MiG-29 fighters has also collapsed. Slovakia is complaining that the MiG-29s, its MiG-29s, some of them are in very poor condition. They may not be flyable. Bulgaria is now saying that it's not going to supply MiG-29s at all. And there are reports coming out of Bulgaria that the MiG-29s that it does have, some of them are not in flyable condition, and those which are would probably only be able to keep flying until the end of the year, because without Russian technical support, they can't be maintained for long. So all these problems all starting to accumulate. And there's been more reports about problems with JDAM bombs. These are the American precision-guided bombs, which the Ukrainian MiG-29s were expected to use. And it looks as if these aren't working out very well either. And there's been discussion, apparently there's been some agonizing as to why this is going on, why the Russians are able to